Okay, why don't we get started? Oh, Julie's taking a photo. Okay. Want to welcome everybody on behalf of Masterpiece Action and our co-sponsors, who are Jewish Voice for Peace Boston, Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment, the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, and the Community Church of Boston. Thank you for being here. 18 months into the Gaza genocide, it shows no sign of letting up. We realize now that we have, if we didn't realize before, that we have a long process to build this movement and change U.S. policy. And so we wanted to do an educational event, and Phyllis wrote a book. I think it's, how many editions have you had your book, Phyllis? About 7?
This is a new book.
New book. It's not the old book.
7
It's a completely rewritten book. So we thought we should look both at the historical roots of this problem, also its reflection in American politics, and some of the recent and current developments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rami Khouri. He is a journalist and academic who lives in Cambridge, but is also based in Beirut. And so he's going to both introduce Phyllis and also be in dialogue with her today. Rami, shall I give it to you?
Got it. Thank you very much, Cole. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks to all the sponsors. I'm honored to introduce Phyllis and to have a conversation with her.
I wonder if it's your phone.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Put that away.
My phone too.
It's an honor to be with Phyllis on the same table. Oh, it's still,
Yeah, we got to bring this.
maybe
No, you want the speaker to be in front of you.
maybe because of this thing here.
It's a conspiracy.
All right, here we go. Is that better? Yes. All right. So I just want to make a couple of quick comments about Phyllis and emphasize why it's so important to listen to. I want to just emphasize why it's so important to listen to what she has to say and to read her book. She has about 50 years of experience in doing the critical 4 or 5 things that you really have to do to understand what's going on in the Middle East or in any other area, but she focuses on the Middle East, which is to convey facts, to analyze the facts and the realities, to mobilize people to work on these issues, to advocate for justice for all concerned, and to keep all of that within the context of a focus on policy making. So this isn't an exercise in television entertainment or getting a promotion in your job or something. This is aimed to change policy. The US government, the Israeli government, Arab governments, European governments, any governments around the world, and other public institutions. And her immense knowledge is captured in this new book, which follows some of the pattern of the other ones, which is a Q&A format. And when you look through the contents, it's really daunting how many details there are about the issues she covers. But that's exactly what you need to do to have a serious understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which has been ongoing now for over a century. And then the last thing I want to say is that her activism in mobilizing for policy change is really pretty impressive, and has gone on for decades and decades, and she'll mention something about that. And the point I want her to start with, if I could ask her, is to tell us what's actually different now than 10 or 20 or 30 years ago when she was involved in some of this stuff. What's different now, and what does she think is what are the 1 or 2 critical priority areas where people like us and others who are concerned need to focus their attention and activism? So with that, Phyllis, it's all yours.
Thanks. I think we're caught in your book. Yeah. Thank you, Rami, and thank you all for coming on this rather gloomy day. But I think after yesterday, how many of you were out on the green yesterday? Everybody, yeah. It was pretty great, right? I was at the one in New Haven. It was pretty great. You know, these last 18 months have been really hard for everybody who cares about people in the broadest sense, for everybody who cares about the Middle East, for everybody who cares about this country, for everybody who cares about Palestine. This has been a really, really hard time. And what we're seeing right now in the last couple of months is that it's not only been hard and getting harder, it's also taking a higher price. We're all paying a higher price for the work that we do. And those who are paying the highest price, the most vulnerable, who are immigrants, who are trans, who are Palestinian or Arab, who are people of color, have always paid a higher price. But this is a critical question, and it goes in some ways directly to why I wrote this book now. You know, some of you may have seen these earlier primers that I wrote. You know, there's one on Palestine, Israel that has gone through multiple iterations and expansions and whatever, and then there was one on Iran and one on Iraq and some other stuff. But we realize now this is a different moment. This is a different political moment. And one of the things we have to come to terms with is understanding that how we understand what's going on now, how we come to look at events and then figure out what does it mean, what do we do about it, how do we change it, has everything to do with when you start the clock. And how we understand history is shaped by when you start the clock. So if you start the clock, as far too many people did, and powerful people, and mainstream media people, and a lot of others, certainly in this country, but in other places around the world, if we start the clock on October 7th, 2023, we're going to get one set of history. We're going to get one look at what history means, because it starts on that day when Palestinians, led by Hamas, attacked into Israel, broke through the wall that surrounded them and had kept them imprisoned for 17 years and occupied militarily for 46 years at that point, I guess it was, and attacked first military targets and then some civilian targets as well. And it was an outrage. And if we said, well, let's look at a different start point. If we start the clock on 2007, what would be different? Well, what would be different was that's when Israel imposed a full blockade on Gaza, on 3.2 million people, of whom half were children, and said, we are now going to prohibit almost anything from going in, and what goes in, we are going to account for truck by truck, piece by piece, and in terms of food, calorie by calorie. They took a message from what the US had done in Iraq, when the UN sanctions that were actually US sanctions imposed officially by the UN to give the US some credibility, which they never deserved and really never got, thankfully. The sanctions were aimed at providing the bare minimum of food available for Iraqis to not die of starvation. The Israelis did the same thing, but they did it publicly. They had a cabinet meeting, made their decision on how many calories should be allowed per person, because, as one member of the Knesset, of the cabinet said at the time, we don't want to starve them to death, we just want to put them on a diet. So they winnowed out what foods would be allowed, how much of it each day, based on how many people were in Gaza, and not one bit more. And like the sanctions that were imposed on Iraqis, children were not allowed to have chocolate, because these are Palestinian children. Why should they have treats? Iraqi children, why should they have chocolate? So rice was allowed in very small proportions. Pasta was not allowed, because pasta is better than rice. People like it more, so they shouldn't get to have it. Because this is a punishment. This is a punishment, a collective punishment, which was one of the earliest of the war crimes that Israel has carried out. If you start the clock in 1967, you get a different set of history, when Israel first militarily occupied the Gaza Strip, along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, etc. And you would have a very different history to look at. If you start 75 years before, in 1948, with the Nakba, what Palestinians call the catastrophe, what Israelis call the War of Independence, you would have still another version. So the question of what's different depends on when you start the clock. But it is true that from October 7th, 2023, there have been major differences. A full-scale, publicly acknowledged genocide has erupted against the Palestinians of Gaza by the Israelis. And in the West Bank, throughout those 18 months, the Gazification of the West Bank has been underway. More than 1,000 more than 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed since October of 2023. Almost all of them ordinary civilians, more than half, like in Gaza, children, women, elders. 140,000 were displaced in the first week. 250-odd thousand have lost their homes since that time and told they will never be able to go back to their refugee camps. These are people who were already refugees once or twice or perhaps 3 times. In Gaza, 80% of the population were already refugees. So what changed? There have been attacks on Gaza every 2 years, every 3 years, beginning in 2008. Cast lead that was in that Christmas, 2008 and 9, where for the first time there were F-16s bombing Gaza. When South Africans came to visit Palestine, knowing that Israelis were imposing a kind of apartheid, a little different than South African apartheid, but equally in violation of the International Covenant Against Apartheid. When they came to visit, they said, as terrible as apartheid was for us for so many generations, the South African apartheid regime never bombed us with warplanes. We never had US F-16s in the skies. So it's a different thing. And what, to their extraordinary credit, what the South Africans recognized, knowing so well what apartheid looks like and what it takes from themselves and globally to build a movement against apartheid, they also were the first as a government to recognize and acknowledge that this was genocide. And they knew, as every country that has signed the Genocide Convention knows and refuses to acknowledge in most cases, because almost every country in the world has signed the Genocide Convention, certainly including the US, and including Israel, by the way, that convention, like the Apartheid Convention, is similar. Unlike a lot of international law that is both incredibly complicated, you read it and say, what does this mean? All this legalese and phrases in Greek and I was going to say Greek and Roman, but that's not quite right. These legal things in Latin and Greek that, I don't know what that means. It's not designed for me to know what it means. It's designed to keep people from knowing. But what those two conventions do is say in very simple language both what does apartheid require and what's relevant for us today, what does genocide mean? What does it take for an act of violence to count as genocide? And it's important partly because the word genocide is publicly well known, but a lot of people have a wrong definition of it. People think it means mass killing. And in some cases it does. In the case of Gaza, it is increasingly that. But it means much more than that. The definition of genocide is an effort using one or more of 5 different violent acts in order to carry out a specific intention to eliminate a group of people, either all or part of a group. And you don't have to kill them all. You don't have to kill any of them, actually. The first of the 5 is killing people from the group. The second of the 5 is injuring people in the group. The third of the 5 is creating conditions that make it impossible for the group as a group to survive. So if you just kick people out of their homes and tell them they can't come back, and where they go is their business, that's genocide. If you intend it for the purpose of destroying that group. And what's complicated is, in most cases where something looks like genocide, the acts are pretty easy to understand. You know, one government kills a bunch of people somewhere else, identifies people they don't like and tries to kill them. But that second part, the part about the specific intent, is usually really hard to prove. Because how do you prove what's in somebody's mind? You know, in this country, we have some specific intent crimes. Burglary is a specific intent crime. You break into somebody's house in order to steal something. And to get convicted of burglary, in theory, the prosecutor has to prove both things, that you broke into the house and that you broke into the house to steal stuff, right? If you just broke into the house for the hell of it, that's not burglary. It's probably a crime, but it's not that crime. The same is true with the crime of genocide. If you kill a bunch of people for no particular reason, you're a mad person, that's not genocide. That's collective murder. It's pretty bad, I'm not, but it's not genocide. For Israel, it was really easy to prove genocide because they announced it. In the language that began within hours of the attacks of October 7th. You heard Israeli officials, political leaders, the prime minister, the deputy prime minister, the president, the minister of defense, the speaker of the Knesset, major figures in the cultural world, journalists, academics, and the military leadership, all using the language saying, these are animals, we have to kill them all. It was language that we in this country are all too familiar with. I know many of you know of the Sand Creek Massacre in the 1860s, during the so-called Indian Wars, right? When a group of US soldiers were ordered by their commander, who happened to be a Methodist minister. In his other life, he was, it's like it's like having this church connected to the army recruiting station next door, but this was way worse because they were out actually actively killing people at that moment. He ordered his troops to attack the tribespeople who were camped on Sand Creek. And some of them came back to him, to their credit, and said, these are peaceful people, it's the middle of the night, they're sleeping, there's women here, there's children. And his answer was, nits make lice, kill them all. And they came back and said, the children? And he said, the children, they will grow up to be grown-ups. This was the same language we were hearing. Kill them all. They are human animals. And then it was Netanyahu who said, I won't use that language, it's an insult to the animals. So this is the language that we were hearing. This is the language that is evidence of intention. And when you combine that language with the actions that we all saw hour after hour after hour, 24/7 on our phones, on our televisions, on our computers, in the newspaper, on the television, you could not avoid it. That combination is what makes it genocide. And the other thing about genocide, in the Genocide Convention, is that it's not just illegal to do all that stuff for that terrible reason, but it's illegal for anyone else to be complicit in that crime and to not do everything in their power to stop it if it happens and to prevent it from stopping if you can. That was the finding of the International Court of Justice on the preliminary stage of the South African case. They haven't even gotten yet to the real evidence. They haven't brought in the witnesses yet. They haven't brought in the documentation. Their 85-page document of these crimes were reported, but we haven't seen the beginning even of what that's going to look like when the witnesses, the victim statements are brought into court directly. And even with that preliminary information, the finding of the court almost unanimously was that this is plausibly genocide, and they ordered 6 serious consequences for Israel right now to make sure that any of them that are in fact genocide stop, and that if they are not yet genocide, that they not proceed further. So it was essentially, it included what amounted to a ceasefire, even though they didn't use that term. So this is a hugely different situation than what we faced before. And I think for us in this country, where so much of our work involves trying to change the policies, as Rami was saying about what does it mean to work on this issue, changing the policy is the goal. You know, the goal isn't to get a bunch of people elected to Congress who will make great speeches. You know, that can be useful in mobilizing people, it can be useful for all kinds of things. It can be an indicator that that's the trajectory of what's going on, what's going ahead. But that's not the goal. The goal is for them to be able to change the rules, change the policy, change the laws, because they finally realize they have no choice. That's what we're facing. That's our job. And movements, and I'm going to say just this and then turn it back over to you, Rami. The movement part of it, if we look at the movement that emerged so spontaneously and so powerfully in the first days after the Israeli assault began, you know, the Palestinian rights movement in this country that has been around and growing stronger and stronger for 25 years or more, that movement, we can't claim credit for the hundreds of thousands of people who poured into the streets saying, ceasefire now, ceasefire now. Microphone now. There you go. This was something different. Hello. Yeah. This was something different. And it was people as human beings responding to what was happening to human beings across the world. For some of them, people they had been taught to not care about. For some of them, people that they had just never thought much about. And for a lot of people who had cared about them for a long time but hadn't done much about it because they were working on other important issues. They were working on climate, they were working on immigrant rights, they were working to stop racism, they were working on women's rights, they were working on LGBTQ rights, they were working for labor rights. All of that is important and has to go forward. And when you're doing all of that, sometimes you just don't have the bandwidth to take on another crisis. But this one was different, and people saw it as different. And they poured into the streets on their own and recognized that the demand had to be ceasefire now. But they did 2 other things. One, they kept that message discipline, which I gotta say, a lot of our movements are not so good at most of the time. Ceasefire now was the clear, undivided call from everybody. But the second thing they did was to redefine what ceasefire meant. So it was no longer enough after the first couple of weeks to say ceasefire now. First of all, it had to be ceasefire now and permanent. And then quickly it became ceasefire means only number 1 is stop the bombing, stop the shooting, stop the tank fire, stop the drones, stop the air war. That's first, but you can't stop there. Number 2, allow in, push in all of the desperately needed humanitarian supplies that were being denied to 2 million people, half of them children, that already had seen tens of thousands of civilians killed, and that were already starting to die from hypothermia, from lack of food, from lack of water, from lack of medical care, from lack of fuel. To let in all that, that's number 2. And number 3, the most important, arms embargo. Stop sending the weapons. Because whatever you say, whatever the president says, I'm heartbroken, please stop killing so many Palestinians. He may well have meant it. I think he probably did mean it, frankly. But it didn't matter because the actions always speak louder than words. And the actions were more consistent than the words and more powerful than the words. And the actions were, how much money do you need? How many billions more do you need? How many planes? How many 2,000-pound bombs? Oh, do you need more of the 500-pound bombs? Okay, we'll send you those, and we'll send more tank shells right now. Oh, actually, we may hold those 2,000-pounders for a couple of months, put them aside for a little bit, but we'll send you extras of the 500-pound, and it'll make up the difference. And I'm heartbroken. Why are we surprised that Benjamin Netanyahu felt he had no obligation to abide by what his biggest supplier, funder, armor was saying? Because he continued to send the weapons regardless. So that was the other thing the movement understood, that we had to demand an end to the arms sales. Stop sending the weapons is now understood as part of what ceasefire now means. So this is an incredible development that we never had in this country. We've never had a Palestine movement as broad as these people who have come out into the streets, that included people who operate way closer to power than any of us ever dreamed of. And that means we have a lot of responsibility as activists who have worked on this issue for a long time to figure out how to keep that movement going, how to work on it in the context of a big, broad movement that's arising right now to stop fascism in this country, where what's happening internationally is the international component of that same horror that we are seeing here at home. How do we do it together? That's our challenge. And now I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Yeah, you've touched on 3 or 4 of the key elements, and they're all linked together, and we can kind of go back and forth on these issues as much as we want, but let me take them one at a time and ask you first, why do you think, and what is the significance of the fact that most Western governments acquiesced in the genocide or actively assisted it? Some of them didn't, but most of them either didn't say anything or helped with guns and diplomatic support, whatever. How do you interpret that?
Yeah. This is a really key question, because in many situations prior to 2023, when Gaza in specific was attacked by these Israeli campaigns that they call mowing the grass, it's self-declared that this is not about self-defense, this is not about keeping anybody safe, this is about keeping Palestinians to understand who's in charge, that they not get too uppity. And it's very explicit, it's quite common. The language is used publicly in Israel, it's in the press. If you Google mowing the grass plus Israel, what you get are the series of attacks in Gaza in 2008-09, 2012, the horrifying one in 2014 that lasted for 55 days and ended with the murder of over 2,200 Palestinians, and everybody thought it could never get worse than this, to 2018, again 2021. There's been a sequence of these. And in most of them, the Europeans, who generally support US positions as a starting point, generally support Israel, and some of them provide arms to Israel, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, several others, they would not change that policy, but they would make harsh statements of condemnation against the Israeli attacks, not right away, but if it lasted more than a couple of days, they would do so. And crucially, at the end of it, they would kind of sigh and say, okay, we'll rebuild Gaza again. And 3 times, EU money rebuilt parts, at least, never totally, but rebuilt parts of the Gazan infrastructure. And remember, we're not talking about an infrastructure like this. We're talking about refugee camps. We're talking about the bare minimum of survival level shelter that was being destroyed, the bare minimum of water treatment that could make a minimum amount of water potable enough for Gazans to drink. And don't forget, it was back in 2012 that the United States, as if, the United Nations said Gaza will be unlivable in 2020. And people in Gaza said, excuse me, I think it's pretty unlivable now. But that was the official UN position. By 2018, the UN said Gaza is unlivable. But what a surprise, there were still 2 million people living there. Mostly it was unlivable because of lack of water. So every time there was one of these attacks, the first target would be the water treatment plants. And Europe would come back and say, we will rebuild them. This time, nobody has said that. The Europeans haven't said it. The Gulfies certainly haven't said it. No surprise there. They rarely say much of anything, and they certainly don't provide any kind of support to Palestinians. They say certain things at the UN when they feel that the public pressure is getting a little too much, and they're worried that there could be another Arab Spring that faced Bahrain and Oman and some other countries. But doing something is not on their agenda. So in some ways, this isn't different. But what is different is that there is now this legal reality that has transformed the international law sector of the world, people who care about such things, which are not so common in this country, but in the rest of the world they are. The Europeans, the European project, the creation of, quote, Europe as a unified grouping of countries. Is that this? That's that, okay. Just checking that it was me doing it. I mean, I was going to yell at somebody else if it wasn't. I'll try and hold still. I talk with my hands, it's that Jewish thing, what can I say? Jews and Italians are the worst, it's like, okay. Well, the problem that we face with the Europeans is that while they came together as the project of Europe.
That one's, I don't know. That's the one you this.
You're caught here.
We have that there. Okay.
Your cup is at risk.
Oh, yeah.
Is this on? Yeah. That sounds better, right? Okay. The European project ostensibly was supposed to be a project of human rights. That's what was supposed to make Europe, quote, different than the rest of the world. That its basis of unity, what you had to do, or more importantly, what you had to say to join the European Union was, we believe in human rights, we like the UN. You had to do all that. And you had to have democratic elections, and who was exactly going to say how free and fair they had to be? But you had to say those things. And that was a point of pride for Europeans, even when it was, it was only partly true sometimes, it was kind of weak, and in some countries hardly existed at all, but it was like better than the rest of the world. I mean, nobody else had a unified, it certainly wasn't true here, that when the states came together to form the US, that it was based on human rights. No. So, this was a European thing. And that was a lot why they talked the way they talked about Palestine. We're allies of Israel. They're a democracy. Not saying necessarily they're a Western colonial democracy, which is, of course, the origins of the Zionist project, unlike the European project. They were very explicit about it. The writings of the founders of modern Zionism, Theodore Herzl, in his exchanges with Cecil Rhodes, when he asked for Rhodes' support, the infamous European British colonialist, he wrote to Rhodes asking for support. Can you help me get the endorsement of the king? There's no evidence that Rhodes ever bothered to answer him. But in his letter he said, I'm asking you for support, and you might wonder, why do I care about your support? Why am I asking for your support? You're interested in Africa. I'm interested in this little slice of Arabia. You're concerned about Englishmen. I'm concerned about Jews. So why am I asking you? And then he answers his own question, and he says, because our projects are both something colonial. I remember reading that as a young student activist and saying, wait a minute, nobody ever taught me that in Sunday school. What's that about? Because I was a very strong supporter of Israel doing all this, Zionist youth group work. And I did what a good Jewish girl was supposed to do, go to your father's library and read Herzl. And I found that letter and said, whoa, this is kind of new and different and not very good. And I was sort of done with, that part. But that's a huge thing in Europe, is that commitment to human rights. And let's not talk about what happened first. Let's not talk about the Belgian Congo. Let's just not talk about it. And in that context, what Europe does and doesn't do becomes something that can be rooted directly to their history. They were part of the history of colonialism in Palestine. as they were in South Africa. The Boer War was not a war between the indigenous population fighting back against the Boer settlements, who were the Dutch settlers who had come to take their land. They were fighting against the British, who had come before the Dutch. And in Palestine, the Zionists were fighting first against the British, because they had all the guns. The indigenous population, they didn't have so many guns. They weren't such good fighters. So all of this can be traced back to issues of settler colonialism. And I think for the Europeans, that's part of why it becomes very tricky to talk about what responsibility do they bear, what responsibility will they take, what will they do to ameliorate the situation, is all limited by their own history of colonialism that looks just like what is happening in Palestine.
Thank you. Related to that point a little bit is why the Israeli government and its propagandists in the United States always refuse to go back and look at historical issues, as you've done, and your book lays this out really well. But the historical context is absolutely critical. Though at the same time, if we look at the public opinion in the United States using polling evidence as probably the best evidence, the public protests are important and activism is important, but the polling evidence is pretty emphatic that over half the country wants a ceasefire and wants a Palestinian state next to an Israeli state. This is unprecedented. When you and I started in this arena in the 60s or 70s.
60s for you, 70s for me.
Yeah, a long time ago. I remember after the '67 war, I'd get into discussions and debates with people, and they'd say, "Oh, the Jordanians and the Egyptians want to just destroy Israel." I said, "Wait a minute, what about this? Is about Palestine. This is what it's about." And they say, "Who are the Palestinians?" The Palestinians were not even mentioned, were not acknowledged. Now there's a majority of Americans that supports a Palestinian
More
state.
than Israelis.
There's a historic transition taking place. It's slow, it's steady, but it's very consistent. A lot of it has been led by progressive Jews, church groups, activist groups. Many people in this room have been involved in this, and across the region. And now we've gotten to the point where the Palestine issue, in the form of the Israeli plausible genocide on Gaza, has entered into domestic American politics in various ways. The uncommitted movement was an early sign of this. And now we've seen the Israeli-driven move by the U.S. government to shut down Palestinian advocacy voices, including us and others here who've had lectures in the United States or Canada postponed because of pressure against the host institutions that were going to host us. So we just shifted to another institution. So there's no real silencing of Palestinian voices because there's many other people who want Palestinian voices, advocacy to be heard. And when I say Palestinian voices, I should always repeat, as I've done since 1966, when we talk of justice for Palestine, we're talking about equal justice for Israelis and Palestinians in a manner that is consistent with international law. That the Israeli state already exists, the Palestinian state should exist, and that's the ultimate goal, is to have Palestinians and Israelis living in secure, recognized, dignified, and viable states. But now the new thing is the impact of public opinion and people's attitude to the genocide has pushed the Israelis to push the government here to shut down voices of Palestinian advocacy, institutions of Palestinian advocacy like Students for Justice in Palestine, and the pressure is coming in directly on universities, including many here and everywhere. So there's a link now between justice in Palestine and the constitutional rights of Americans: free speech, due process, equal equality before the law. And in American institutions, universities, public libraries, the media are slowly being degraded because there are critical issues linked to genocide that are not allowed to be discussed. So how do you analyze this, and how do you see the public opinion pushing back?
Yeah. Ooh, this is a key set of questions, and for us, probably the most important in many ways. You know, this question of justice is at the root of a lot of this. Much of this shift in public opinion, not all of it, but a lot of it is generational. And a lot of it is coming from what many are calling the justice generation. The young people who came of age politically to political consciousness sometime maybe around 2015, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, around 2018, especially the summer of 2020 when George Floyd was killed. And you had people redefining their own identity in the context of the struggle for justice, in the context of defining their work, in the context of racial justice. And suddenly Palestine, for many people, was being looked at as a racial justice issue, not as a foreign policy issue that you might take up the way you might take up work on Congo or Ukraine or something else. This was a racial justice issue. And it was particularly true among that generation, among young people. And if you look at the shift in the Jewish community, which, while it's not probably the most important these days in supporting Israel in Congress in terms of money and such, AIPAC as an organization is the single most important one. But if you look at lobbies overall, I think the Christian Zionist lobby has outpaced in influence, particularly within the Republican Party, which, if you all forgot, are in power right now. They are more influential than the Jewish components of the lobby. So what we see in the Jewish community is that support for Palestinian rights and a rejection of tying support for Israel to Jewish identity is far more prevalent among young Jews. So one of the key polls, and I agree with you, Rami, polls these days are so powerful, and it's so incredibly frustrating because, as you probably have experienced yourselves, members of Congress don't have a clue. Sometimes they know and they just lie about it and say, really, I had no idea. Please send me that poll. And you know they've got it. You know. But a lot of them don't because they don't read. They don't have time. Some of it is institutional. They have to spend an average of 4 hours a day raising money. So they spend that time on the phone not reading about what are the latest polls showing about public opinion on Palestine. But the poll in 2021, conducted by the Jewish Electorate Institute, it's called, of Jewish voters, 25% of American Jews said Israel is an apartheid state. That was one of those wow moments. How'd that happen? Why? How? What? Were we that good? What, how? But in that same poll, 38% of young Jews said Israel is an apartheid state. Now, the question of aid to Israel right now, you're right, Rami, it's more than half. 77% of Democrats say no more aid to Israel. 77%. This was during the Biden administration, Biden's own party. So the divide between the electeds and the base was far bigger than it ever had been before on this issue, right? So that's one of the things that has been so astonishing, is this massive shift in the discourse, which we've been talking about and writing about. The institutions like the IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, whose sole purpose in life is to get Palestinian voices into mainstream media, to get supporters of Palestinian rights to be quoted in all of that, in all things media. When they started almost 20 years ago, they couldn't get a hearing anywhere. It was one person. God knows, Margaret worked it by herself for some years before she got anybody to listen to her, that this is an issue about the media. Now they have a huge staff, 17, 18 people, 20 people, something like that, scattered across the country, and they can't keep up with their work because of that shift in the discourse. So how we understand that and use it is hugely important, because it also takes a certain kind of nuance and caution. The fact that we know that 77% of Democrats want an end to military aid to Israel doesn't mean that it's going to be voted on anytime soon. So we can't go in and just start yelling at a bunch of Congress people about why aren't they doing it. we have to do the education work with them the way it took us 20 years to do the education work with the population as a whole to change their understanding of the issue and their understanding of where their base is on the issue. So that's a huge challenge, because working with Congress is really, really hard, and it's dispiriting, and it's, you feel like you're losing every step of the way, until suddenly, we had a bit of a defeat last week with Bernie Sanders' effort in the Senate. But if you look at the first one, these were the I always forget this acronym. JRD. The JRDs, the Joint Resolution of Disapproval. It always takes me several people to get it. It takes a village for me to get the language right. The JRDs, the first time, that was 2 months ago, something like that, 3 months ago, and there were 19 Democratic senators who voted for it. Now, it wasn't enough, obviously. It didn't happen. But that's 40% of the Democrats in the Senate. That was unprecedented. That had never happened. So we have to look at it in this question. It goes back to history. The young people coming into the movement right now take one look at the US media and say, my God, this is horrifying. The way they cover Israel, it's like the Palestinians hardly exist, right? It's so unfair. And it's absolutely true. But what's also true, this is one of those you have to have two ideas in your mind at the same time. What's also true is that if you compare that to how it was 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, on October 6th of 2023, it would be entirely worse at a huge level, right? So those of us who are privileged enough, and looking around the room, I'm thinking most of the people in this room are old enough. I'm sure there are a couple who are not. But most of the people in this room are old enough to be able to remember and talk about how much worse the press was back then. So it's important that we do that, because otherwise people come into this movement and feel like, what do you mean you've been in this movement for 20 years and this is what you got? That sucks. Because that's true. That's true. But it's like it took us this long because you've got to learn your history. And what's incredible is when we look at the work of these incredible young students on campuses in their encampments, what were they doing in their encampments? Well, the Jewish kids were doing a Seder, right? The so-called anti-Semitic processes included Seders because it happened to correspond to Passover. The rest of the time they were doing teach-ins, but they were also having to defend themselves against people trying to shut them down, so they didn't have a whole lot of time. So that's another reason, frankly, for writing this book, is for people like that who are incredibly passionately supportive of Palestinian rights and yet have never had the chance, the time, the whatever, to be able to look up those questions that maybe they're a little embarrassed about to read. But it comes back to understanding the role of our movements. It's because we've had a movement in this country fighting for Palestinian rights that there was a kind of infrastructure that when that spontaneous movement arose on its own, we're not taking credit for it, but when they arose, there was a movement that could do some of the work of getting the permits for the protests and making sure the porta potties were in place. The hard work of being organizers. Even though we didn't get people out there, we got a place for them to be. We had examples for them to see. When JVP took over the New York train station, Grand Central Station, when they took over the island where the Statue of Liberty is. All of this is so, so important because it provides a model to people who hadn't been part of this movement. And that's how movements grow. And the last point is how it integrates with the movement that we see now, which also has risen spontaneously since the inauguration, since January 20th, the day after the ceasefire, saying this isn't a good enough ceasefire. It collapses, it's not complete, and we're going to be part of this movement that is focusing on the punishments of people in this country, the economic punishments by tariffs, and the punishments against free speech on this issue, because it's Palestine that's the first low-hanging fruit. Not the only one. The immigrants are right in there. Trans people are right in there. But the linkage right now, the most common one is around Palestine. People who had the temerity to show up at a protest, who had the temerity to think that it would be good for somebody to be able to negotiate peacefully, calmly, between the student activists and the campus administration. that would be a good thing. And after all, you have a green card, which gives you the right of free speech, as does a student visa. We should be very clear. The Supreme Court case in Harry Bridges' case, the labor union leader who won that so important case, that says in the victory of that case that non-citizens in the United States have the same right of free speech. It's the issue of free speech, not in the abstract, but the right of free speech to talk about Palestine that's on that agenda today.
The linkage of these two movements for Palestine rights and to defend American constitutional rights is one of the most dramatic and exciting things that I've experienced. And the background to that, which is the public opinion slow change over time, which we both mentioned, is also pretty profound. Yet the policy changes at the level of the Congress and the executive haven't happened yet in a serious way. Ilan Pappé, in his magnificent 530-page book on lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic, which I recommend to anybody who likes to read long books, but it's just so rich with information about how the Zionist movement hooked up with the imperial forces in England and then the United States to achieve what they've achieved, which is to create Israel and to expand Israel and now to project Israeli dominance across all the adjacent lands in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. How did they achieve that? They achieved it by focusing almost exclusively, or at least primarily, on the executive branch and the legislative branch, the people who allocated money and used their military power. The media mattered, universities mattered, the cultural and arts mattered, but the two institutions that the pro-Zionist lobbies focused on, and still I think focus on, are the legislature and the executive. In your experience working in advocacy and mobilization and policy change, what do you see as the most urgent area of emphasis now, given this reality? Because the pro-Israeli groups and the Christian Zionist nutcases will always, I mean, I say nutcases
in the clinical sense.
Yes, of course, politically. In other words, detached from reality. But the focus of the pro-Israel lobby groups is to keep the American government giving them the arms and the money and the diplomatic protection that they need, which it has done, and to echo the propaganda of the Israeli government, which just in the last 3 days has been challenged by the reports about the 15 ambulance drivers in Palestine who the Israelis said, oh, they were looking suspicious, they were driving with no lights on. And then, of course, the evidence of a video came out showing they had all their flashing lights on. The Israelis then said, oh, we made a mistake. So the ability of the pro-Israel forces to keep the American government repeating its own lies is diminishing. Because so many of these things that the Israeli government, especially the armed forces, have said over the last 18 months, after people did forensic investigations and journalistic assessments, proved to be lies and incorrect. So given this reality, how do we focus, we the people and institutions in the US and Western countries who are trying to get a more even-handed policy, starting with a ceasefire and no more arms, but that's not working very well in terms of impact. Is it just a question of we need more time, or are there avenues where more focused pressure, especially this growing coalition that's involved now in this work, can have an impact?
Really good question. Let me start with one point of history. It might be the only thing I've ever said that I disagree with you.
No.
And that is that I think it's true right now that the Israel lobby focuses on getting the money from Congress and getting the executive branch to support them at the UN, protect them at the UN, and send troops and planes and whatever is necessary. That's absolutely right. But in the past, the reason they can do that has to do with their work on the cultural side, the education side. So if you look at the history of the Israel lobby in the US, it goes way back to before there was an Israeli state, right? But it didn't have a whole lot of influence. You know, it had some, it wasn't nothing, but it wasn't particularly significant in the decision-making stuff in Washington. But one of the things, and we can look at sort of the history from the time that the special relationship developed between the US and Israel after the 67 war, that started with the Pentagon, because it was they saw that as, wow, these guys are good. You know, they defeated 5 Arab armies, which wasn't even true, but you know, they were good. They were good fighters. They managed to, you know, occupy the last remaining remnants of Palestinian territory in 6 days. So yeah, it's not surprising. That whole next period of the Cold War, Israel was a hugely important strategic ally of the United States. So the lobby gained a lot of credibility and importance and whatever, because it was kind of like if you push on a parked car, nothing really happens. But if the brake gets released and the car is on a hill and you start pushing it just a little bit, it's going to take off, and you can get a lot of credit for pushing the car down the hill. The same thing, all of a sudden the Israel lobby seemed really important because it was now pushing for something that the US government wanted to do. So it looked like it was successful all of the time, and people love success in this country. So it got a lot of support. What it did with that support was create an incredibly sophisticated level of educational propaganda and cultural work that managed to reach virtually the entire population of this country. So in public schools, from K through 12, you would learn about Israel in age-appropriate curricula, and that was an extraordinary achievement that no other national lobby has ever achieved. I remember in 10th grade when I was in one of these weird honors classes in international relations, and the teacher was threatening all of us at the beginning of the semester, saying, you're each going to have to pick a country, because by the end of this term, you're going to have to write a really in-depth report on some country, and you're going to have to do all that research and learn about it. And you saw hands waving in the classroom, I want to do Israel, I want to do Israel. Not just the Jewish kids, because the country we knew more about than any other country was Israel. You know, we didn't learn about Chad in school. We didn't learn about Belgium. We certainly didn't learn about the Belgian Congo. You know, we didn't learn about Argentina. We learned about Israel. We all wanted to write about Israel. I think half of us did. But that was a huge accomplishment of the Israel lobby. The implications of the movie and the book Exodus, right? 1964, commissioned by the Israel lobby, by the great writer, and Leon Uris is I guess he's dead, maybe, I don't know. He was an incredibly great novelist. And then they make this movie with, you know, the handsome Ari Ben-Kanan, played by Paul Newman, and the beautiful blonde Shiksa, who he falls for, and I don't remember her name, but it was like one of those movies. You know, my youth group, we all fell for it. We acted it out, right? You know, we acted out the UN scenes in it. That played a huge role in how people in this country came to see Israel, and that's what makes it possible for that. And AIPAC money has a big role. I'm not saying that's not important, but the fact that has gone on for so long and changed the views, shaped the views of so many generations of Americans, it has everything to do with how Israel gets away with what it gets away with. So that's kind of the historical framework part. The part right now is the better news, exciting part. It's always been true that the easiest part of the discourse shift to do, and it's really hard, but easiest, is changing people, right? Because people are people. People have hearts. People will listen to other people, right? So changing public discourse is the easiest part. The next easiest is the media. Because eventually there's pressure, people start demanding it, people start asking questions, and if you don't cover it, you don't get as many clicks or whatever, so that becomes the next one. And on the question of, if we look at, say, the last 20 years, the public shift has been extraordinary. The media shift has been significant. The policy shift has just barely been touched. And that's the next one. That's the hardest one. So we know that going in. It's not just about doing the congressional work, it's about doing the public work, it's about doing the educational work, all those things. But now we're in a situation where more and more people in elite positions, not just members of Congress, but senators, governors, mayors, members of city councils, are taking public positions in support of changing the policy. Not necessarily the way we talk about it, not talking about human rights, international law, and equality for all as the basis of what should be US policy and, towards Israel and towards Palestine. But talking about the need for change, talking about the need to stop enabling military assaults. And I think that the time issue is going to be a factor that as time goes on, we will see more people being elected, all of that. The problem is right now we're facing a genocide. We don't have the time. I think even 2 years ago we would have said it's going to take time, et cetera, et cetera. Right now people are dying on an hourly basis. Babies are dying of lack of warmth because the tents have shredded. And since March 2nd, not a single truckload of food, of water, of fuel, of medicine, of tents has been allowed into Gaza. And we don't have that time. So the urgency is there. And the challenge is we can't let the urgency of the real world mean that we don't think strategically in terms of what we do. So the last part of my answer is what happened yesterday. So there wasn't a connection being made by the people who called for this incredibly broad, amazing, powerful, fabulous demonstration in somewhere over 1,500, I think it was 1,500, cities and towns and little villages across this country. But in a lot of those places, Palestinians did show up, and people with Palestinian flags and wearing keffiyehs and calling for Gaza to be included in the list of what we should keep our hands off Gaza. It wasn't on the official list, but people in a polite way, in a way to mobilize with people, not saying, how dare you people call a demonstration and not include this issue. Because for a lot of people in this country, there are other important issues that are also earth-shatteringly important and are going to lose potentially other lives in this country and around the world. So we can't diminish the importance of that. And what people did right, in the big one in DC, they called a separate Palestine protest, but divided it into some number of contingents that were sent into the march in different parts so that you saw Palestinian presence throughout and didn't make it into a fight that it's us versus them, but it's us and them together. It's building a movement together. That's not easy. Building a movement just around Palestine is really, really hard. Khouri's laughing over here. People have such different views, whether the issue is wanting to get two states or not. For me, it's easy. I'm a Jewish girl from California. I don't get to have a say in how many states there are in your part of the world. That's for Israelis and Palestinians to work out. Our work here is not about states or not states, one state, two state, red state, blue state. That's not the issue. The issue is international law and human rights and equality for all as the basis of our government's policies for what it does, not just what it says. So who do we give money to and who don't we give money to? Who do we give arms to and who do we luckily stop sometimes giving arms to? Those are the jobs for us. Palestinians will figure out for themselves at some point, whenever anybody allows them to breathe, what the strategic long-term goal is. Whether there's land for a Palestinian state, I think, is a big question. So it may not be that. It may be an anti-apartheid movement in the entire territory that is controlled by the Israeli government. But that's, I don't get to say I clearly have opinions. It won't surprise you to know that. But it's not up to me to say. Our job is to change our government's policy.
Thank you. Last point I want to ask is one of the new things that's evident today in this whole scene of political contestation within the United States, and also abroad a little bit, mostly in the US, for the first time ever in my life, and certainly in the Arab-Israeli conflict of the last century and more, there is a serious movement by Palestinian groups linked to American groups that are not Palestine focused, like ACLU and Center for Constitutional Rights and all kinds of lawyers unions, and they now take significant court action. Yes. Anytime something happens that is constraining the right of Palestinian justice advocacy, there's somebody in court within a couple of hours, and the briefs are already ready to just fill in the things. And it's quite, and you saw it with Mahmoud Khalid and others. Within hours, they're in court stopping the immigration of these people. So we have, for the first time, I believe, it's not a level playing field, but we have an actual playing field where two parties are competing. The pro-Israeli Zionist movements and the pro-Palestine justice movements are both able to act in social media, public protests, court actions, and now we see the pushback in the universities. How do you see the importance of the legal world in this arena, and what is your reaction to the initial number of cases that have happened? Are you heartened by this?
Absolutely. This has been an extraordinary development. I'm heartened by the results, certainly, because most of the cases so far are winning. Now, this is at the level of district court or immigration court, the lowest levels of the courts. And what happens when they get up to the courts of appeal and ultimately the Supreme Court, all bets are off. We don't know. But we never had this level of victories at the bottom level either. So, if we look back in history again, you see a trend here. I like to talk about history. In 1987, the LA 8 case, ring bells for anybody, a few heads nodding. 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan who was married to one of the Palestinians, who were all Palestine activists, were arrested in Los Angeles on immigration charges. Just like now, arrested by the FBI, middle of the night, in their beds, with helicopters circling overhead. LA Times headlines the next morning, terrorist nest rousted across LA, all of this. They were put in jail, they were brought before a judge, and the judge said to the prosecutors, the prosecutors were saying, no bail, keep them in jail, they're dangerous terrorists, and the judge said, well, let's see some evidence, and I'll give you, I think it was 48 hours, the first round, and they came back in and said, well, the group that the magazine that they were distributing has carried out terrorist acts, and he said, yeah, but what have they done? And they were, well, they've been distributing this magazine. I said, no, you're not making it here. They were in jail for 23 days, and at the end of it, they had not produced anything because there was no evidence, right? And the judge said, I'm going to let them go. And so the prosecutor said, no, well, we have to have high bail. And the judge says, this is ridiculous, and released them all with no bail. But it took 21 years to win that case. 21 years. 2 trips to the Supreme Court, which sent it back to immigration court, back to district court. And we kept winning at the bottom levels, and then it would be appealed, and yeah. But this time around, we're winning earlier. And it's different. It's different because more people are watching. It's different because more people are understanding. The first group that came to endorse the LA 8 case as a solidarity gesture was the Japanese Citizens League. Because these were people in Los Angeles who had been the ones who were sent to the camps. And what was released at the time of that trial was a government document whose name escapes me. It was a long document about how it would involve 7 separate U.S. agencies that included the FBI and all of these police agencies that called for, in the case of a national emergency, the rounding up and arresting and detention of anybody in this country from any of 7 Arab countries plus Iran. And they were to be put in, wait for it, Oakdale, Louisiana. Sound familiar? And they had the camps ready, they had the bunk beds, the whole 9 yards. And it was exposed right at the time of this trial. And what was going on with the trial, of course, matched what this thing called for. So we were able to bring that in a separate suit, a parallel lawsuit. But it took 20 years to win these cases. Now, people are already across the country feeling like they could be next. They could be next. That first, it's the people with a technical violation of their student visa. The LA 8, 6 of them were student visas, and the guidance that they got that the government gave to the prosecutors was start with the technical violations first before you have to get to the politics. If you can get rid of them with technical, do it that way. My favorite was the youngest of the six. He was a pharmacy student, and one of his advisors one time had said, you're having a bit of struggling with one class, take a couple units less next quarter. And one quarter he took 11 units instead of 12. You're supposed to take 12 units. That was considered a deportable offense, right? So this is what we're dealing with. And now people this time around are feeling like they could be next. A green card holder was the next one. And then somebody who's not just a student, but a physician with a very important specialty that isn't available mostly in this country, well, she's vulnerable too. So this is the moment when these cases come up. When the case was brought against Biden and Blinken in the federal courts in California by Palestine Legal and the Center for Constitutional Rights, that was and the National Lawyers Guild, that was an extraordinary moment, and the judge had a really hard time with it because he said, I forget exactly how it worked, but he said, I have to throw this case out. I can't keep it. I can't deny the motion to dismiss because of the distinction between the judicial branch and the executive branch. This is clearly an issue for the executive branch. But then he wrote this long opinion stating that this looks like genocide. This was extraordinary. And things like that I will not do that. Things like that have not happened. So we are in a completely different moment when not only we have institutions like Palestine Legal, which we haven't had before. We've had the Center for Constitutional Rights and the National Lawyers Guild for a very long time. They were both the main components of the legal team for the LA8. But this is different. People across the country think this is an issue of free speech. It's not an issue of defending terrorists. That's a whole different world.
Yeah, and just to add one last point to that, and then I will open it up. The most heartening thing that I see as I speak at universities and colleges and local groups and across the U.S., they're now at the level of preemptive action. So you go to colleges here in Boston and Philadelphia and New York, other places I've spoken, and students are preparing documents that they give out to other students in case something happens. Here's the number to call. Right. When I was doing a book tour in the Detroit area about a book I co-authored on Hamas, of all things, I went to give a talk supposed to go across the border to Windsor in Canada, and everybody said, no, don't go, they won't let you back in. I'm an American-born citizen, so I don't have the vulnerabilities of visa holders. And they said, don't go, leave your phone behind, don't take your laptop, don't take any of your talk notes, like you don't know what's there. So I left it all behind, and nothing happened. Turned out there was an easy crossing going for the night, but people had prepared for every eventuality. And so there's a massive education process going on to students especially, and I'm meeting with other students in other colleges looking at these issues. It's really, really heartening to see this going on.
It is. I want to just add one point to that, which is this is where we get into the intersectional movements, because the immigrant rights movement has been doing this for a long time, since the first Trump administration. And the Palestinian movement and the supporters of Palestinian rights, who are the most vulnerable right now, are getting that information from the immigrant rights movement. So we are working together. The lawyers are working together, the activists are working together, and increasingly people are working together. And that's the heartening part of all of this.
So on that positive note, thank you, Phyllis. And we open it up now for Q&A. People would like to ask questions or make very, very short comments. But questions, Julie? Can you?
I think, are we going to try and get the mic to people?
Yeah, since it's being taped, maybe it's a good idea to carry it around. Yeah. Will it reach?
And we can try and use the other one if we behave. Is it still connected?
There we go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, this is the one.
Do I have to stand behind the speaker?
Yeah, if you can, yeah, it's fine.
Behind. Okay. Thank you so much. That was incredible. and I
Get some water.
look
I'll be
forward
right
to
back.
reading your book.
Wait, get some for me too.
I have not yet. I have a question. I want your opinion.
Oh dear.
Cole and I are signatories on a letter to the CEO and president of Mass General Brigham. On the board of Mass General Brigham is, right, you've probably heard this,
Yeah.
is the CEO of Lockheed Martin, okay, on the board of Mass General Brigham, a hospital, the biggest hospital in, is it the whole country? I don't know, but at least it's Massachusetts. I worked at Mass General for 20 years. I'm a physician. Anyway, we sent this letter. We want a meeting with her. We want to take Cled off the board, okay? So there's, 8, 10 of us on the letter. We've had no response. It's been about a week and a half. We have a press conference planned for next week. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think she read the letter and is getting her lawyers? Do you think we're going to get arrested? Do you think, I'm going to get my license taken away as a physician? I just don't know in this environment. So I'm really curious about your thoughts, because you had mentioned about how the Army recruiting station and the church are right there. And it's just like, there's so much. Like, take Lockheed Martin on the board of MGB, a hospital. Yeah. And we take our Hippocratic oath, first do no wrong.
I think this is a great case. I think this goes directly to moral issues. And doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers, and as we know, first responders, as we just saw, among the hundreds and hundreds of humanitarian aid workers who have been killed in Gaza, the recent 15. This brings the question of moral injury to a whole lot of people. So I think it's a terrific case. Mabruk, congratulations for that. It's a great one. What will happen? I don't think anybody knows. I don't think anybody will be arrested for this one, but I certainly can't guarantee that. Will people lose jobs? It would not be the first time that people lose their jobs for statements, right? Harry Bridges, the famous case that said that people that are not citizens have the right to free speech in this country, was based on an effort to deport him. He was a union leader for what he had said. They claimed that he was associating with communists, and that was going to be a deportable offense. We don't know any of this. It is a risk now to sign a petition in a way that it never was, and in a way that our First Amendment says it should not be, that we have the absolute right of free speech. And yes, that doesn't include saying fire in a crowded theater if there's a danger of the immediate impact of your words. There's no way that a letter to a government official, to a university president, to a CEO warmonger is going to have any effect on anything by itself in an immediate level. So there is no constitutional way to say that this is illegal. That doesn't mean somebody's not going to say it's illegal. And then the Constitution only matters when people stand up to defend it. That's the reality. It's not unlike, in certain ways, the decisions of the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is the highest court in the world. It's called the World Court as a nickname kind of for that reason. It's the official UN court. The International Criminal Court is a different thing. It's an independent institution. It goes after individuals. Mostly it goes after black African leaders. That's a different struggle, not unrelated entirely. But the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, where the South Africans brought the case against Israel, is the UN court. Their word is law. But they have no army. They have no police. They don't even have a process server who can go somewhere in the world and serve a paper on somebody. They depend on us, because what their decisions say is that their decisions get turned over to the United Nations, which then allows the US to veto everything in the Security Council, and so instead it goes to the General Assembly. The General Assembly issues powerful majorities, powerful resolutions, harsh demands on Israel, which Israel can say, we don't care, because the General Assembly officially has no enforcement power, except for us. That's the enforcement power. It's what we do as civil society around the world, forcing our own governments to take a position that's going to implement everything the General Assembly calls for, one country at a time, after another, after another, after another. And eventually there will be enough that the US will feel compelled to go along, the way they did with, finally, after so many other countries, virtually every other country in the world, had imposed sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Finally, the US went along with it. It will be that. Now, what will the price that will be paid? There will be prices paid. We're seeing it on campuses. We're seeing it everywhere. Will it go to doctors and hospitals? Probably at some point in some way. I don't think they could come up with a logic of how people could lose licenses. But lose jobs? Sure, people lose their jobs easily because it's management who decides it, depending on the kind of contract you have. And as we know, even that doesn't matter. U.S. federal jobs were supposed to be so safe. And they just announced that we're going to eliminate those jobs. And nobody stands up in the Congress. And so they get away with it. So that's what we're dealing with. It's the political struggle against how do we challenge any effort. But this effort is such an important one, to say that the role of US military contractors, the producers of these bombs, of these planes, of these drones, of the tank shells, all of it. 68% of Israel's military stuff is produced here. We pay for 40% of the Israeli military budget. Half of our military budget, which, as you all know, dwarfs the military budgets of the next 10 countries, including the big spenders like China and India and Saudi Arabia, etc., and Russia. In that context, what the US does has everything to do with our budgets. Martin Luther King said that budgets are moral documents. In our case, it's an immoral document. Because half of, the budget itself is almost $1 trillion now, the official military budget in the United States. It's 52% of the entire discretionary federal budget. If you add in the stuff around the border control, federal police, federal detention, all of that, you get to 62% of the budget. So the question is, where does that money go? Half of it goes to military contractors in this country. Almost $400 billion goes to Lockheed Martin and McDonnell Douglas. So that's who is paying the $1 million salaries of this CEO and others. So the notion that they are somehow being allowed to sit on a hospital board as a way of giving themselves a clean image, I don't know if there's a color that's associated with medicine, but it's what we used to say about it's whitewashing, or it's greenwashing, or it's pinkwashing. It's if there's a color for blood washing. There you go. It's medical washing something. That's what it is. That person wants to be on that board so that he or she can say, I'm a good person. I'm a good guy. My volunteer work is on this hospital. I raise money for this hospital. It's like, give up your multi-million-dollar salary and stop producing weapons. Then you can talk about being a good person. Don't use this hospital as an excuse.
Thank you.
I've read her book. It's really great. And
I didn't tell her to say that.
and it's amazingly up to date. Now, you talk about anti-Semitism in the book, and I'd like to hear more, because I have been really feeling weighed down by the extent to which that anti-Semitism is successfully being mobilized. And, I look at the way the international legal system is being demobilized pretty dramatically. And yet here, all our institutions are just buckling under to anti-Semitism. So I'd like you to say more about that. I mean, we're right here. Many of us are trying to fight, push back against a new state commission on combating anti-Semitism. And I don't know if you want to say something about the Israeli Ministry of
Strategic Affairs.
Yeah. Diaspora Affairs.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Their recent conference on combating anti-Semitism was attended mainly by the far right, and even the ADL withdrew. So, I mean, how are we going to really undercut this very effective weapon?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. This is a huge challenge for our movements. You know, for probably 20 years, 25 years, in my work, talking to groups all over the country and meeting with people and stuff, one of the consistencies is the first question being, how do I talk about this issue without being called an anti-Semite? Right, I can remember that conversation in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and the 2000s, and on and on and on, and it's still there. And it's much worse now, because, as Nancy was saying, it's being weaponized. False claims of anti-Semitism are being weaponized so effectively. So they're being used by these major institutions. And with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism being accepted, this is the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. Alliance, sorry, not association. That has created a new definition of anti-Semitism, which is being taken up by the federal government when we did have a Department of Education, which apparently we don't anymore, the Department of Education, in the State Department, members of Congress are talking about it, cities, states, 30 states are considering taking this up as an official definition legally, including Massachusetts, I think. And what it says, you know, the definition itself, it's not like nobody understands what anti-Semitism means. The definition was easy. The guy who wrote it, who worked for the IHRA, he wrote a definition that was fine. It was like hatred of Jews as Jews. It's like, you know, duh. That's not complicated. What made it incredibly problematic was that he attached to it examples, 11 examples, of what that could look like in the real world. Of those 11, 7 of them are not examples of hatred of Jews as Jews. It's criticism of Israeli practices. And if you conflate those things, any criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic. And that's what has been so powerfully effective, a lot with this definition, but even groups and people and countries and institutions that don't use that definition are doing the same thing, saying that any criticism of Israel is ipso facto anti-Semitic. And they can't answer why, you know, well, it's the only Jewish state. Well, yeah, 80% of its population happens to be Jewish, but does that make any criticism of the government a criticism of those people? It's a criticism of what countries do, right? And it's an incredibly tricky possibility of how we challenge it, because this is now the single most effective point. One of the arguments against it that I find very effective, particularly in Jewish organizations, but not only, is that one of the effects of this weaponizing of false claims of anti-Semitism is that that's getting all the bandwidth, it's getting all the oxygen in the room. This is what anti-Semitism looks like. Those Palestinian flags, those people saying from the river to the sea, that's anti-Semitism. And that means they're ignoring the real anti-Semitism that is on the rise in this country, that we saw in Pittsburgh in 2018 when 11 Jews were executed at prayer, in Charlottesville when people were marching with their tiki torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and Trump said, "They're very nice people." In San Diego, this is real anti-Semitism that is on the rise. And it comes out of white supremacy. The history of modern anti-Semitism in this country is rooted in the Ku Klux Klan. It started in the 20s. There was early anti-Semitism that goes way back, but modern anti-Semitism started in the 20s with the Klan, and that's why you had things like the murder of the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish shopkeeper, at the same time that African Americans were being lynched in hugely larger numbers. Smaller numbers, very small numbers, of Jews were being lynched because it was part of white supremacy. Jews were not considered white, and they were paying the price of being people of not white. They were never quite seen as people of color. Jews of color, who of course have existed forever, were not really in the picture very much at that time in this country. But Jews were not considered white, and racists, the Klan, now it's the Nazis, it's all of these friends of Trump, these right-wing groups, his best friends, with their Nazi salutes. They are the anti-Semites that we have to worry about. And lastly, the anti-Semitism of the Trump administration itself, its actual policies. Remember back in 2018, Trump goes to the region, he goes to Israel, and he announces a massive set of changes of US policy. He says the most important one, we're going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, because that's what Israel has declared as its capital. Despite US law, despite international law, despite a host of UN resolutions, doesn't matter, I'm going to move the embassy. He says the Golan Heights belongs to Israel. It's sovereign Israeli territory. He goes to the Golan Heights with Netanyahu. He says that annexing most of the West Bank is fine. It goes on and on. He comes back to the US, he meets with the Republican Jewish caucus, the big fundraisers, the big shots of Jewish Republican money. And he says to them, he's telling them all that he did on this trip, and he's, puffing up and being very excited about it. And he talks about the Golan Heights, and he looks out at this crowd of American Jewish wealthy people and says, I was with your prime minister when I announced this. And not one of them raised their hand and said, excuse me, Mr. President, he's not our prime minister, we're Americans. You're our president. We don't have a prime minister, we're Americans. None of them said that. And none of the press coverage ever mentioned it. Then he looked around when he got to the question of the pièce de résistance, is moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And he looked out into the audience, and he picks out Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, the biggest funders of the Republican Party, the biggest funders of Israeli settlements, and the biggest funder of Donald Trump, and said, Sheldon and Miriam, I did it for you. What better evidence is there of claiming that Jews are just in it for the money? This is what almost got Ilhan Omar practically kicked out of Congress for not saying that, but for saying that other people do that. And he proved she was right. And nobody said a word. Well, a few of us did, but you know what I mean. Nobody in the mainstream press, no Jewish organizations took him on and said, my God, what are you saying here? Nobody was offended. This is the real anti-Semitism that is coming up. And when people focus all their attention on going after students that are trying to stop a genocide, instead of looking at people who are concerned about anti-Semitism have something to say. We should be doing something to stop it. That's what's being left behind. Nobody's working on that issue. ADL certainly isn't. These organizations that claim to be so interested in anti-Semitism and how to fight it, they don't even talk about it. They only want to talk about supporting Palestinian rights. Yes, Joseph, I see you eager to talk here.
So just one
Come.
Just one other dimension to this is, if you will, the deep alliance between extreme Zionists in this country and the authoritarian dictatorial forces here, where they're playing one another. Think in terms of the assault on higher education. It really has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's about trying to eliminate freedom of speech, freedom of thought in this country, and to move to create a totalitarian environment here. So I think we need to understand that dimension of how this game is being played and find ways to be resisting it.
Absolutely. Yeah. probably just another one or two questions, because we want to sell some books.
Yeah.
I think we just have time for maybe one or two more questions, because we want to sell some books and have time to sign them and stuff. Yeah.
Do you think the
Come up here, take the mic.
That's right, my voice
No,
is
it's,
loud.
it's for the tape.
it's being
It's
taped.
not your,
Do you
no.
think...
Come take the mic, please, so it'll be, your voice will be on the tape.
All right.
Sorry.
Get it.
Sorry. Okay.
Statistically, do you think the uncommitted movement had any effect on getting our president elected?
Good question.
And if it did, was that a strategic mistake?
The uncommitted movement itself had no impact on the final election. It was a project of the primaries. As you probably know, the movement that continued after the primaries was quite divided about what to tell people to do. And it ended up not telling people what to do because they couldn't decide for themselves. Many people who were active in the uncommitted movement said, if I lived in a swing state, I would vote for the Democrats. If I lived in a safely democratic state, I wouldn't. Other people said, it's just too dangerous, I would vote for the Democrats no matter what. Other people said, I can't imagine any conditions under which I would vote for it. So people said many different things. There was no official position. Now what is true, and what was important, was that the decisions made by the administration of the Biden administration and Kamala Harris, despite the pressure that had succeeded in changing public opinion, despite knowing what the party wanted, when they refused to even allow a single speaker at the convention who was going to be pre-vetted, the speech was written, they submitted it, the only person there who submitted a speech to be vetted was the state assemblywoman from Georgia, who happens to be Palestinian, in which 2 lines of a 2-minute speech had anything to do with Palestine. And they said, no, can't talk. And people knew that and were pretty angry. What turns out to be the case, we just saw the new poll, again we go back to polls. This was a poll that was commissioned by IMEU, but it was conducted by the U.gov, one of the big polling agencies. And they looked at all the people who voted for Biden in 2020 and did not vote for Biden in 2024. Now, in that grouping were people who didn't vote at all, people who voted for Trump, people who voted for no one, voted for every other, voted for their members of Congress and all the other things, but didn't vote for president. It was a whole set of things, but who did not vote for Harris in 2024. And they gave them 6 choices of issues that were their most important, saying we know there were probably many, but which was the single most important issue that changed your mind? And number one was not the economy. I thought it would surely be the economy. That was number 2 at 26%. Number 1, 29%, was the Middle East. And that was the reason given, the most important of several reasons that people did not vote for Kamala Harris. And I think that's an astonishing statement about the work of not just the uncommitted movement, that was part of it, but that incredible movement that rose up to say, this is not something we can accept. We will not allow our country to enable a genocide. And we have paid an enormous price for that electoral impact. And the alternative would have been, and I say this as somebody who lives in a very safe place, Washington, D.C. votes 94% Democrat. It's the bluest dot in the country. Since it's not a state and we don't have anybody in Congress, thank you all very much. But, this was an extraordinary recognition of the power of that issue. What we would have faced in the alternative would be a Democratic Party led by those who supported genocide jail. And people have to make their own judgment about whether that would have been better than what we have now. What we have now is horrifying and frightening and is supporting genocide. We knew that would be the case. And I think the challenge that the uncommitted movement took on was an extraordinary one. I think they were incredibly creative and strategic in their thinking to narrow it to the primaries and not to take it on to the final election in November. And they knew there would be an impact if they were successful, that people would still be wondering, should we, shouldn't we? But it's not as if this was the first time that people didn't vote for the lesser evil. You know, that's what happened in 2016 as well. And this is a huge challenge. I don't know what the answer is going forward in terms of elections. I don't know what kind of electoral strategies are going to emerge around 2026, for instance, let alone 2028, if we even have elections in 2028. So I share your fear and your concern about what the result has been. Absolutely right.
Well, one thing that was horrifying is that
You've got to do it on tape, sorry.
Sorry.
Do it up here.
Well,
Palestine has become second and third page news now in all media. If you read a paper, you won't find anything on the first page, and certainly not on the second page. And the same goes for TV news as well. It gets mentioned sort of at the end. And yesterday at the so-called demonstrations against Trump, there in Boston, there was no speaker invited to speak up for Palestine. The only person that even mentioned it was a Native American speaker. The person who was leading the discussions or the event mentioned Gaza once.
Pressure from protesters.
Well, sorry?
I think he did that with pressure from the
Right.
crowd.
So I'd like to know who organized this event, and, you know, frankly, we're now having to fight even to hear our voices at mammoth rallies. They're all focused on Social Security and some other issue. So, anyway, sorry, I'm ranting.
I think the demonstrations yesterday were fantastic. They were broad. They had a range of issues. Did they have all the issues? No. Did they have some issues wrong, in my view? Yes. Calling for hands off NATO, I think, is a terrible demand. So, yeah, I think there were lots of problems. But I really disagree with your assessment about the media. I think what we're seeing about the 15, that was a New York Times investigation that proved that the Israelis were lying, and they used that word. This is back on the front page. It's been page 2 for a little bit. Then it's back on page 1. It was never in the papers at all before this. So I urge a little bit of, let's not pretend that there's no change underway. It's been a massive change. The protests yesterday, there were people with Palestinian flags and slogans and all of that throughout the crowds. And you can be damn sure that the people who organized it, who included some of the big organizations like Indivisible and Move On, and in every city it was joined by local coalitions. The nationals didn't do that on their own. It was always the local people. Some had Palestinian representation, some didn't. There was a big contingent, several contingents in Washington, which was the biggest of all the protests. So it is moving forward. There is motion on this. It has affected the press. The press is extraordinarily different than it's ever been in this country. What's going to happen with the elections? That's our job. We don't know yet. If there's we're going to have to fight for elections. I would say that saying that this was just about Social Security and some other issues is, one, undermining how important Social Security is for a whole bunch of people whose lives depend on it, as we know, exactly. But that's huge. It's huge. And those other issues amount to our democracy. As flawed and weak and